The bloodletting. It had been years since the five of them had gathered together. Too many years, in fact. Life had pulled them in different directions. Marriages, children, careers, and the inevitable drift of time. But when Sarah proposed the idea of a weekend getaway, the others had eagerly agreed. It was to be a chance to relive the carefree days of youth, to reconnect with old friends in a remote cabin nestled deep in the woods. The air was crisp with the bite of early autumn when they arrived, the trees standing tall and silent, their leaves just beginning to turn. The cabin was rustic, charming even, with its wooden beams and stone fireplace. It was the perfect setting for their reunion. Laughter filled the air as they unloaded their bags and settled in. The familiar warmth of friendship quickly rekindled. But as the night wore on, something began to feel off. It was a small thing at first. A shadow that lingered in the corner of the room, a flicker of movement just out of the corner of the eye. But it was enough to make Sarah uneasy. She tried to shake the feeling, telling herself it was nothing more than the isolation of the cabin playing tricks on her mind. It wasn't until they gathered around the fire later that evening that the unease truly began to take hold. "That's an interesting piece," said Emily, nodding toward the small, ornate box that Sarah had placed on the table when she entered the cabin. It was old, the wood darkened with age, its surface carved with intricate symbols that none of them recognized. The box was unremarkable, save for its air of strange antiquity. "Oh, that?" Sarah's voice was tight, as if the question had caught her off guard. "It's just something I found at an estate sale. It looked unusual, so I thought I'd bring it along." The others gathered around the box, their curiosity piqued. Sarah had been vague about its origins, but they hadn't thought much of it. She had always had a penchant for collecting oddities, things with a history, and this box was no different. But as they opened it, an uncomfortable silence descended upon the group. Inside the box lay a small, blood-red stone, its surface smooth and cold to the touch. The moment the stone was exposed, the air in the room seemed to thicken, as if something ancient and malevolent had awoken. "I don't like this," muttered Jack, the first to break the silence. "There's something wrong with that thing." Sarah, who had been the most enthusiastic about bringing the object, felt a sudden chill run down her spine. She had no explanation for it, but the stone seemed to pulse with an unsettling energy, as if it were alive. "Maybe we should put it away," Emily suggested, her voice uneasy. But before anyone could act, the ground beneath them seemed to shift. The fire in the hearth flickered violently, casting long, twisted shadows across the room. The temperature dropped, and an oppressive silence filled the air, broken only by the soft, rhythmic thudding that seemed to come from deep within the walls. "Did you hear that?" Ben asked, his voice barely a whisper. The others nodded, their eyes wide with fear. The thudding grew louder, faster, as if something was moving beneath the floorboards, something heavy and insistent. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch toward them, curling like tendrils of smoke. "Put it back in the box," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Now." But as she reached for the stone, something stopped her. The stone had begun to glow, a faint red light pulsing from within, casting an eerie glow over the room. It was as if the object had come alive, and it was demanding something from them, something that none of them could give. Then, the whispers began. They were soft at first, like a distant murmur, but they grew louder with each passing second. The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, speaking in a language none of them understood. The words were filled with malice, with hunger, as though they were calling to something, someone, to come forth. Suddenly, the door to the cabin slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows. The group jumped in alarm, and panic began to rise in their throats. The fire in the hearth roared to life, its flames dancing wildly, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. Then, as if responding to the chaos, the stone in Sarah's hand pulsed once more, and a dark figure appeared in the doorway. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by a cloak of shadows. Its eyes, when they finally came into view, were empty, black voids that seemed to swallow the light around them. The figure spoke, its voice low and guttural, a sound that made the blood in their veins freeze. "You have awakened me," it said, "and now you will pay the price." The room grew colder still, the air thick with a sense of dread that pressed down on them like a physical weight. The figure's presence seemed to draw the life from the room, and the friends felt their strength draining away, as if the curse of Ashenwood. The town of Ashenwood was a place forgotten by time, nestled deep in the heart of an ancient forest, where the trees stood tall like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches twisting toward the heavens. It was a place where the air felt thick with secrets, and the wind carried whispers from long ago. The kind of place where one might expect peace, far from the chaos of the modern world. For Samuel and Clara, along with their 2 young children, moving to Ashenwood seemed like a dream. They were tired of the hustle and bustle of city life, seeking tranquility in a place where they could start anew. The house they had purchased was an old, weathered cottage on the outskirts of the village, surrounded by dense woods and rolling hills. It was charming in its decay, with ivy crawling up its stone walls and the scent of pine and earth filling the air. The villagers, though few in number, welcomed them with warm smiles and polite nods. But there was an unease beneath the surface, a tension that Samuel couldn't quite place. They spoke of the village's history in hushed tones, mentioning how the town had once been prosperous, but had fallen into decline over the years. No one seemed willing to speak of the past in any great detail, and when pressed, they would simply smile and change the subject. As the days passed, Samuel began to notice strange occurrences. At night, the village seemed to grow unnaturally quiet, the only sound the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. He would hear whispers in the trees, voices that seemed to beckon him into the forest, but when he would venture out, there was nothing but the eerie stillness of the woods. The villagers, too, seemed to act strangely. They would greet him with hollow eyes, their smiles never quite reaching their faces. It was as though they were trapped in a dream, going through the motions of daily life without ever truly living. One evening, as Clara prepared dinner in the kitchen, Samuel wandered into the village square, hoping to speak with the town's elder, a man named Gregory, who had lived in Ashenwood for as long as anyone could remember. He had heard whispers of the village's past, and he hoped Gregory might shed some light on the mystery that seemed to cling to the town like a shadow. When Samuel found him, the old man was sitting on a bench beneath the large oak tree in the center of the square. His eyes were clouded with age, but there was a sharpness to them that seemed to see straight through Samuel. "Ah, you've come to ask about Ashenwood's past, haven't you?" Gregory said, his voice low and gravelly. "Everyone does eventually." Samuel nodded, his curiosity growing. "I've heard strange things. The villagers, the woods. There's something about this place that feels wrong." Gregory sighed, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped his cane. "It is wrong," he said softly. "Ashenwood is cursed, a curse that binds us all." Samuel frowned, his heart racing. "What do you mean? What happened here?" The old man looked around as if ensuring no one was listening, before leaning in closer. "Long ago, the village made a pact with something ancient, something powerful. In exchange for prosperity, we promised to give something of ourselves, our souls, our freedom. Every year, One of us must be sacrificed, and the curse will remain. We are bound by it, and no one can escape. Samuel's blood ran cold as the words sank in. A sacrifice. Who is chosen? Gregory's eyes darkened and he looked away. It is not always the same person. It could be anyone. A child, an elder, a mother, a father. The curse chooses, and those who are chosen, they are never seen again. Samuel's mind raced as he tried to process what the old man was saying. You mean to tell me that the village, the entire village, has been living under this curse for generations? Gregory nodded solemnly. We've tried to leave many times, but the curse will not allow it. Once you set foot in Ashenwood, you are bound to it. There is no escape. Samuel felt a chill run down his spine as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. And what happens if you don't make the sacrifice? What if you break the pact? Gregory's face twisted in fear. The curse will take everything. The land will wither. The trees will die. The rivers will run dry. The very earth beneath our feet will crumble. We will all be lost, and Ashenwood will cease to exist. Samuel stumbled back, his mind spinning. You've been living with this horror all these years? The old man nodded, his eyes filled with regret. We had no choice. Once the pact was made, there was no going back. We are prisoners of our own making. As Samuel turned to leave, his heart heavy with the knowledge of the village's dark secret, he couldn't shake the feeling that he, too, was now a part of it. The curse had already begun to work its way into his life, and he could feel the weight of it pressing down on the death dealer. Richard Harlow had always been a man of ambition, driven by a thirst for power and success that burned like a relentless fire in his chest. He was a businessman, a self-made man who had clawed his way to the top, but despite his wealth and influence, there was something missing, something that no amount of money or prestige could ever fill. He longed for more power, more control, more everything. It was during a late-night meeting with a rival executive that Richard first encountered the figure who would change his life forever. The meeting had been set in a quiet, dimly lit bar, far from the prying eyes of the corporate world. As Richard sipped his whiskey, a man appeared at the far end of the room, dressed in a black coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured most of his face. His presence seemed to draw the attention of everyone in the room, though no one dared approach him. The man's eyes gleamed like two cold, unblinking orbs as he locked gazes with Richard, his voice smooth and unsettling as he spoke. You seek power, Mr. Harlow. I can give it to you. In fact, I can give you everything you've ever wanted. Richard's heart skipped a beat. He had heard whispers of such figures, those who traded in the currency of the soul, offering great power in exchange for a price that was always too high. But this man, this stranger, seemed different. There was something about him, something compelling, that made Richard feel as though this was his only chance to seize the greatness he had always dreamed of. Who are you? Richard asked, his voice betraying a mix of skepticism and curiosity. The man smiled, a thin, cold smile that sent a chill down Richard's spine. I am known by many names, but you may call me the Death Dealer. I offer what others cannot: true power, untold riches, and a future beyond your wildest dreams. Richard leaned forward, intrigued. And what do you want in return? The man's smile widened, though it seemed to grow colder still. A simple exchange, Mr. Harlow. Your soul. For a moment, Richard laughed, dismissing the idea as absurd. A man like him, smart, practical, and grounded in the real world, did not believe in such things as souls or supernatural bargains. He had made his fortune through hard work, not through dark pacts. But the man's eyes, those cold, endless eyes, seemed to penetrate deep into Richard's soul. and for the first time in his life, he felt something stir within him, something that whispered of ambition, of desires that ran deeper than anything he had ever acknowledged. "What's the catch?" Richard asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. The death dealer leaned closer, his breath cold against Richard's ear. "The price is always the same, Mr. Harlow. You will gain everything you desire: wealth, power, influence, beyond your wildest dreams. But in exchange, your soul will belong to me. It will be mine to claim when the time comes." Richard paused, his mind racing. The temptation was overwhelming. The life he had always dreamed of was within his grasp, just one deal away. His rational mind screamed at him to walk away, to reject the offer, but his hunger for power drowned out all reason. He had spent his entire life fighting for what he had, but this was different. This was an opportunity to become something more, something invincible. Without thinking, he extended his hand. "Deal." The death dealer's smile deepened, and for a moment Richard thought he saw something ancient and terrible flicker behind the man's eyes. The figure took his hand, and a cold, unnatural chill surged through Richard's body. He felt a strange sensation, as though his very essence had been touched by something otherworldly. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. "Remember, Mr. Harlow," the death dealer said, his voice soft and hollow, "the price is never what it seems." Over the next few months, Richard's life transformed in ways he had never imagined. His business ventures flourished, and his wealth grew exponentially. He moved effortlessly through the world of the rich and powerful, his influence stretching further than he had ever thought possible. The people who had once dismissed him now bowed to his will, and he found himself at the top of the corporate ladder, untouchable and invincible. But as the days passed, Richard began to notice strange changes. At night, he would wake in a cold sweat, his body trembling with an overwhelming sense of dread. He would hear whispers in the darkness, voices that seemed to call his name, but when he turned to look, there was no one there. His reflection in the mirror began to shift, his own image becoming distorted, as though something was wrong, something had changed within him. And then, the nightmares began. He would find himself standing in a dark, endless void, surrounded by shadows that whispered his name. He could feel something, someone, watching him from the depths of the darkness. The death dealer's face would appear, grinning at him from the Flesh Eater. The small town of Everwood had always been a quiet place, nestled between thick forests and rolling hills. Its residents lived simple lives, and its streets were lined with the kind of homes that seemed to belong to another time. Homes that stood as quiet witnesses to decades of history. But something was changing in Everwood. Something that could not be explained by the passage of time or the seasons. Something dark and terrible had taken root. It began with the disappearance of a local farmer, James Harrow. His wife, Sarah, had gone to bed that night expecting nothing more than the usual stillness of the rural landscape. But by morning, her husband was gone. His bed was undisturbed, his clothes neatly folded, but there was no sign of him anywhere. At first, the town assumed he had simply left, perhaps for a drink at the tavern or a late-night stroll through the woods. But as the days passed, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. 2 weeks later, Sarah's brother Peter vanished in the same mysterious way. His house, too, was found empty, save for a single horrifying clue: a pile of bones bleached white and scattered across the floor of his living room. The bones were human, but the flesh was gone, as though it had been stripped away in a grotesque, violent manner. The town was shaken. Whispers spread through the streets, and fear began to take root. The sheriff, an aging man named Roy Bennett, tried to calm the townspeople. reassuring them that there must be a logical explanation for the disappearances. But even he could not ignore the growing number of bones that had begun to surface. Bones that had no explanation, no origin, and no answers. It wasn't long before the first real sign of the creature appeared. One night, as a full moon rose over Everwood, a group of friends gathered at the local diner. They had been talking about the disappearances, trying to make sense of it all, when a blood-curdling scream shattered the night. The scream came from the woods, distant but unmistakable. It was a scream of agony, a scream that chilled the very marrow of their bones. The group rushed outside, their breath visible in the cold air. The scream echoed again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy dragging along the ground. When they reached the edge of the forest, they found the body of a local man, Jacob Miller, lying in the dirt. His flesh had been stripped from his bones, leaving only the skeletal remains, his eyes wide with terror, his mouth open in a silent scream. The creature had claimed another victim. As the body count continued to rise, the townspeople grew desperate. They fortified their homes, locked their doors, and stayed indoors after dark. But no matter how much they prepared, the creature always found a way to strike. It was swift, silent, and ruthless, leaving nothing but bones in its wake. But the most terrifying part was yet to come. In the midst of the chaos, suspicion began to fester. The townspeople, once united in their fear, began to turn on each other. Whispers filled the air. Who among them could be the monster? Who could be hiding in plain sight, disguised as one of them? It started with little things, strange behavior, a lingering glance, a missed heartbeat. Then came the rumors. Someone had seen a figure lurking in the shadows late at night. Someone had heard strange noises coming from a neighbor's house. The fear was palpable, and it didn't take long for the accusations to start flying. Roy Bennett, the sheriff, was one of the first to be accused. His age, his gruff demeanor, and his long hours spent patrolling the woods made him an easy target. But he swore that he was innocent, that he was only trying to protect the town. His word, however, no longer held weight in a town filled with suspicion and dread. Soon, others were accused. Friends, family members, neighbors. Everyone had a reason to be feared, and no one was safe from suspicion. The town became a place of whispers, where every shadow was a threat, and every creak of a floorboard was a harbinger of doom. Then, one night, as the town's residents gathered at the local church, hoping for some semblance of safety, the creature struck again. But this time, it was different. This time, the creature didn't just leave behind bones. This time, it left behind a message. The body of a woman named Clara Wells was found in the church, her flesh torn away in the same gruesome manner as the others. But in the place of her heart, where once there had been blood and warmth, there was a note. It was written in a strange, jagged script, the ink smeared as though the writer had been trembling. "The monster is among you. Look to the one who is most afraid." The words sent a ripple of terror through the crowd. Who was the most afraid? Who among them had the most to hide? The townspeople began to turn on each other more violently now. Accusations flying, fingers pointed in every direction. The blackened heart. Edwin had never believed in love at first sight, but when he met Isolde, he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew. She was unlike any woman he had ever encountered. There was an ethereal quality to her, an almost haunting beauty that drew him in from the moment their eyes met. Her smile was like a secret, one that invited him to learn more, and soon he was entranced by her every word, every glance. They met in the most ordinary of places, a small bookstore tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. She was browsing through the poetry section, her fingers tracing the spines of books as if she were searching for something that had long been lost. Edwin, ever the bookworm, had approached her with a hesitant smile, and from there, their conversations flowed effortlessly. They spoke of everything, of art, of life, of the strange, unexplainable things that both frightened and fascinated them. It wasn't long before they were inseparable. Every moment together felt like a discovery, and Edwin couldn't help but feel that he had found something, someone, he had been searching for his entire life. Isolde, with her mysterious allure, seemed perfect in every way. But as their relationship deepened, there were subtle signs that something was amiss. At first it was small things, fleeting moments when her eyes would glaze over, as if she were lost in a distant memory. She would sometimes flinch at certain sounds, her face contorting in pain, only to quickly mask it with a smile. But these were things that Edwin could easily dismiss, chalking them up to stress or fatigue. Then came the night of the first storm. The rain had been pouring relentlessly, the wind howling outside as they sat in Isolde's apartment, sharing a quiet evening. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and Edwin couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had noticed, in the days leading up to that evening, that Isolde had grown pale, her once flawless skin now marred by strange, dark veins that seemed to spread beneath the surface like a creeping shadow. Her movements had become stiff, her smile increasingly forced, as if she were trying to hold herself together. As the storm raged outside, Edwin sat across from her, his heart heavy with concern. "Isolde, you haven't been yourself lately," he said softly, his voice laced with worry. "You look different." She met his gaze, her eyes dark and unreadable. For a moment she said nothing, as though weighing her words carefully. Finally she spoke, her voice low and trembling. "There's something I need to tell you, something I've been hiding from you." Edwin's heart raced. He had sensed that there was something Isolde wasn't sharing, but he had never imagined it would be something so dark, so terrifying. "I'm not like other women," she continued, her voice cracking. "My heart, it isn't real." Edwin frowned, confused. "What do you mean? Your heart isn't real?" Isolde rose from her seat and walked to the window, staring out at the storm as though searching for something in the darkness. Her back was to him, and he could see her shoulders trembling. "It was replaced," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "A long time ago, when I was still a child. My heart, it was taken, and in its place, they put something else." Edwin's mind raced, struggling to comprehend her words. "What do you mean, they put something else? What did this to you?" Isolde turned to face him, her expression unreadable. Her eyes, once so full of warmth, now seemed cold and distant. "It was a curse," she said softly. "A curse meant to keep me alive, to make me immortal. But it came at a cost." Edwin stood up, his pulse quickening. "Isolde, what are you saying? What's happening to you?" She looked down at her chest, her hand resting lightly over her heart, as if she were trying to protect it. "The heart they gave me, it isn't human. It's something unnatural. It feeds on life, on energy, and it's slowly taking over my body, piece by piece." As she spoke, Edwin could see the subtle changes in her appearance. Her skin had grown even paler, the veins beneath it now dark and swollen, pulsing with a life of their own. Her eyes, once so vibrant, were now blackened at the edges, as if the darkness within her was spreading outward. "I can feel it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's growing stronger, consuming me. I can't control it anymore. It wants to take everything, my body, my mind, my soul." Edwin's heart ached as he reached for her, his hand trembling. Isolde, we can find a way to fix this. There has to be a way to save you. But Isolde pulled away, her expression turning cold and distant. No, Edwin, she said, her voice sharp. You don't understand. There is no saving me. The heart, it's too powerful. It's already too late. Suddenly the room seemed to grow colder, the air thick with a sense of dread. Edwin stepped back, his eyes widening as he watched in horror. Isolde's. The blood moon ritual. The night of the blood moon had arrived, casting an eerie crimson hue over the sky. It was a night that whispered of ancient secrets and long-forgotten rites. A night that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. For weeks, a group of friends had been preparing for this moment, drawn together by a shared curiosity and a thirst for adventure. They had heard the stories, read the old texts, and seen the symbols etched in the forgotten corners of libraries and dusty tomes. They were ready to perform the ritual, the blood moon ritual. It was supposed to be a harmless game, a thrill for the night. The ritual, they believed, was nothing more than an old superstition, a relic of a bygone era. But as they gathered in the clearing deep in the woods, surrounded by ancient trees whose twisted branches reached toward the sky like skeletal hands, the air grew thick with tension. The moon hung low, blood-red and heavy, casting long shadows across the ground. The wind was still, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. The group stood in a circle, each of them holding a candle, its flame flickering in the unnatural stillness. At the center of the circle lay an altar, a stone slab covered in strange, archaic symbols. The words of the ritual were whispered under their breath, each friend taking their turn to speak the incantations they had learned. The words felt foreign, ancient, as though they carried a weight far beyond their understanding. But they pressed on, their voices growing more confident with each utterance. At first, nothing happened. The blood moon hung above them, casting its red light on the ritual's participants. They laughed nervously, exchanging glances, wondering if they had been foolish to believe in such nonsense. But then, the air began to change. The temperature dropped suddenly, the warmth of their breath turning to mist in the cold night. The ground beneath their feet trembled ever so slightly, a low rumble that seemed to come from deep within the earth. A strange hum filled the air, rising in pitch until it became a deafening roar. The candles flickered violently, their flames twisting and writhing as if caught in some invisible wind. The trees around them began to sway, though the air was still, and a shadow, no, something far darker, moved across the ground, stretching long and thin like a living thing. Panic surged through the group. They had gone too far. The ritual was never meant to be performed by anyone but those who understood its true power. But now, it was too late. The darkness had been unleashed. From the center of the circle, a shape began to emerge. It was like nothing any of them had ever seen, an amorphous, shifting mass of shadow and light, its form ever-changing, constantly writhing as though it were alive. The air around it crackled with malevolent energy, and the ground seemed to warp and twist in its presence. One of the friends, Mark, stepped forward, his eyes wide with terror. "What have we done?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the growing hum. "This isn't just a ritual. It's a summoning. We've called something here." The figure in the center of the circle pulsed, its form now taking on a more distinct shape. A towering, grotesque silhouette with elongated limbs and a face that was both human and something far more monstrous. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, burning red like the blood moon above. It was watching them, studying them, as though it could see deep into their souls. The air grew heavy, suffocating, and the friends found themselves unable to move, rooted to the spot by an unseen force. Their bodies trembled with fear, their hearts pounding in their chests as they realized the true horror of what they had done. The creature, if it could even be called that, let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that seemed to reverberate through their very bones. It was hungry, and it was calling to them, drawing them closer with an irresistible force. The ground beneath their feet cracked open, revealing a dark abyss that seemed to go on forever, as though the earth itself was tearing apart to make way for something far older and far more terrifying. One by one, the friends began to scream, but their voices were swallowed by the creature's presence, their cries lost in the endless void that had opened beneath them. The shadow reached out with long skeletal fingers, its touch cold and unfeeling, and as it made contact, their bodies convulsed, their souls torn from their flesh. The ritual had summoned not a spirit or a demon, but something far more ancient, far more malevolent, an entity that existed beyond time and space, a being that fed on the fear and suffering of the living. The last thing Emily, the final survivor, saw before the darkness overtook her was the blood moon, its red light growing brighter, more intense, as though it were feeding on the terror that had been unleashed.